The 100-hour bombardment had ended 6 hours ago, but the earth still trembled. Corporal Matthias Kern pressed his back against the collapsed masonry of what had once been a shrine to Saint Erasmus, feeling the aftershocks ripple through the blackened stones. The air tasted of cordite and something else, something that made his teeth ache when he breathed too deeply. The signaler's pack weighed heavy on his shoulders, the brass tubes and copper wiring a familiar burden that had become his only anchor in this place where reality seemed to bend at the edges. His orders were simple. Establish communication with the forward elements of the new syncretic Orthodox forces pushing into the ruins of New Antioch. Relay tactical information back to the command bunkers buried 3 miles behind the lines. Simple orders, clean orders, the kind that kept a man's mind focused on the immediate task and away from the deeper implications of what they were doing here. But as Matthias crouched in the rubble, adjusting the frequency dials on his field radio, he could hear them. The bells of New Antioch, tolling in perfect rhythm, despite the fact that every bell tower in the city had been reduced to twisted metal and pulverized stone. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a deep bronze resonance that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Private Jorik Haas scrambled over a pile of debris to Matthias's left, his rifle held at the ready. The boy was perhaps 19, with the kind of pale, narrow face that marked him as one of the new conscripts from the northern provinces. His eyes darted constantly, searching for movement among the ruins. "Corporal, I can hear them," Jorik whispered, his voice tight with strain. "The bells, they're still ringing." Matthias nodded slowly, not trusting his own voice. The sound was getting stronger, more insistent. Each toll seemed to resonate not just in his ears, but in his bones, in the marrow itself. He had heard stories about New Antioch from the older soldiers, tales of the city's 100 bell towers and their sacred purpose. Each bell had been blessed by a different saint, each one tuned to a specific frequency that was said to ward off the influence of the heretic legions. But now those same bells rang with a different purpose, and Matthias could feel something fundamental shifting in the world around him with each resonant note. The third member of their small unit, Sergeant Victor Roth, emerged from behind a section of collapsed wall. His face was grim, weathered by 15 years of trench warfare, and his left arm hung at an odd angle where shrapnel had torn through his shoulder during the bombardment. Despite the wound, he moved with the efficient precision of a career soldier. "Radio contact established?" Victor asked, settling down beside Matthias with a barely suppressed grunt of pain. "Intermittent," Matthias replied, tapping the side of the radio with his knuckle. "The interference is getting worse. It's like something is actively blocking the signal." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Define something." Matthias paused, listening to the ghostly bells that continued their endless tolling. How could he explain the way the sound seemed to wrap around radio waves, distorting them into patterns that hurt to hear? How could he describe the way the static itself seemed to form words and languages that had never been spoken by human tongues? "I don't know, Sergeant, but it's not natural interference." A fourth figure approached through the ruins, moving with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned not to trust the ground beneath their feet. Lieutenant Ernst Kellner was a thin man, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He commanded the signaler units for the 3rd Battalion, and his presence here meant that the situation was more serious than their initial briefing had suggested. "Report," Ernst said simply, crouching beside the radio equipment. The bells are affecting our ability to maintain contact with headquarters, Matthias explained. Each time they ring, the signal degrades further. We're losing coherence in the transmission. Ernst listened for a moment to the spectral tolling that filled the air around them. His expression grew more troubled with each passing second. How long since the last successful transmission? 43 minutes, sir. And the pattern of the bells? Matthias had been dreading this question. They're counting down, sir. Each sequence is one toll shorter than the last. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke. If the bells were indeed counting down to something, then their mission had become far more urgent than a simple reconnaissance and communication task. New Antioch had fallen to the heretic legions 3 months ago, and the 100-hour bombardment had been intended to soften their defenses before the Orthodox forces retook the city. But the bells suggested that something else was happening here, something that went beyond simple military conquest. A sound echoed through the ruins, different from the bells, but equally unnatural. It was a rhythmic scraping, like metal against stone, accompanied by what might have been footsteps. The 4 soldiers immediately raised their weapons, scanning the rubble-strewn landscape for the source of the noise. Movement, 200 meters northwest, Victor reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Multiple contacts. Through his binoculars, Matthias could see shapes moving among the ruins. At first glance, they appeared to be soldiers, but there was something wrong with their movements. They walked with perfect synchronization, their steps matching the rhythm of the ghostly bells. As they drew closer, he could see that their uniforms were those of the new syncretic Orthodox forces, but the fabric was scorched and torn, stained with substances that looked like blood but reflected light in ways that blood never should. "Those are our men," Jorik said, lowering his rifle slightly. "They must have survived the bombardment." "No," Ernst said quietly, his voice carrying a note of absolute certainty. "Those are not our men. Not anymore." The figures continued their approach, and with each step, the details became clearer and more disturbing. Their faces were visible now, pale and slack, with eyes that reflected the gray light of the overcast sky like pools of standing water. They moved without apparent awareness of their surroundings, focused entirely on some destination that only they could perceive. As they passed within 50 meters of the signaler's position, Matthias could see that their mouths were moving in perfect unison, forming words that were lost beneath the sound of the bells. But even without hearing the words, he could feel their meaning pressing against the edges of his consciousness like a physical weight. The radio crackled to life suddenly, filled with static that resolved into what sounded like a human voice. "Echo 1, this is command. Report your status." Matthias reached for the handset, but Ernst caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," the lieutenant said. "Listen to the voice. Really listen." Matthias strained his ears, filtering out the static and the bells, focusing on the transmission itself. At first, it sounded like a normal radio communication, but as he listened more carefully, he began to hear the subtle wrongness in the tone. The voice was too steady, too precise, lacking the natural variations that marked human speech, and beneath the words, barely audible, he could hear something else. A sound like wind through empty spaces, like the whisper of dry leaves across stone. "That's not command," he said, his voice tight with realization. "No," Ernst agreed, "but it knows our call signs. It knows our procedures. which means it has been listening to us for some time. The synchronized figures had passed beyond their position now, continuing their march toward the center of the city. But their presence had left something behind, a change in the atmosphere that made the air feel thicker, more oppressive. The bells continued their countdown, and with each toll, Matthias felt something fundamental slipping away from him. It was Jorik who noticed it first. "Corporal," he said, his voice filled with a strange, distant quality. "Corporal, I can't remember my mother's face." Matthias turned to look at the young soldier, seeing the confusion and growing panic in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I was thinking about home, about the letters I wanted to write when we got out of this place. But when I try to picture her face, there's nothing there, just emptiness." A chill ran through Matthias that had nothing to do with the cold air. He tried to remember his own family, his sister Anna, who had been married just before he left for the war. But when he searched his memory, he found only fragments, disconnected images that seemed to float in a gray void. "It's the bells," Ernst said, his voice heavy with understanding. "Each toll is taking something from us, memories, pieces of who we were before we came to this place." Victor was examining his wounded arm, his expression growing more troubled by the moment. "The pain is gone," he said. "The wound is still there, but I can't feel it anymore. I can't remember what it felt like to be injured." The implications were staggering. If the bells were systematically erasing their memories, their very sense of self, then they were facing something far more dangerous than any conventional enemy. They were being unmade, piece by piece, with each spectral toll. "We need to get closer to the source," Ernst said, standing and shouldering his pack. "If we're going to stop this, we need to understand what's happening in the center of the city." "Sir, with respect," Victor said, "moving deeper into the ruins might not be the wisest course of action. We're already losing parts of ourselves. If we go further, then we'll lose more," Ernst finished. "But if we stay here, we'll lose everything anyway. The bells are counting down to something, and when they reach zero, I suspect our fate will be sealed regardless of our location." The logic was sound, but Matthias felt a deep reluctance to leave their relatively secure position. The ruins around them were filled with threats he could sense but not identify, and the deeper they went into the city, the stronger the influence of the bells would become. But Ernst was right. They were already changing, already losing pieces of themselves with each passing moment. Their only hope was to find the source of the phenomenon and somehow stop it before they lost too much of who they were to function as rational beings. As they prepared to move deeper into the ruins, Matthias made one final attempt to contact headquarters. The radio hissed and crackled, then suddenly cleared to reveal a voice that was all too familiar. "Echo 1, this is command. We show your position as unchanged for the past hour. Are you experiencing difficulties?" It was his own voice, speaking with perfect clarity through the radio, but Matthias knew with absolute certainty that he had not transmitted anything for the past hour. The voice was his, but the words were not. "Someone is using our voices," he said, switching off the radio. "They're monitoring us, copying us, using our own communications against us." "Not someone," Ernst corrected. "Something. Something that's learning from us as we lose ourselves." The four soldiers began their descent into the deeper ruins of New Antioch, moving carefully through streets that had been transformed into a maze of rubble and twisted metal. The bells continued their countdown, each toll stripping away another fragment of their identity, another piece of the men they had been before entering this cursed place. Behind them, the synchronized figures continued their march, and in the distance, other shapes moved through the ruins with the same purposeful, emotionless precision. New Antioch was becoming populated again, but not with the living. It was being filled with something else, something that wore the faces of the dead and spoke with the voices of the living. And with each passing moment, the distinction between the two became less clear. The streets of New Antioch had been transformed into a labyrinth of destruction that defied easy navigation. What had once been the great thoroughfare of St. Methodius was now a canyon of rubble, with sections of collapsed buildings, creating natural barriers that forced the four soldiers to detour through smaller side streets and alleyways. Matthias led the way, his training as a signaler having given him experience in route finding and terrain assessment. But as they moved deeper into the city, he found his usual methods of navigation becoming increasingly unreliable. Street signs had been obliterated by the bombardment, and the familiar landmarks that should have guided them were either destroyed or altered beyond recognition. More troubling still was the way the city itself seemed to be changing around them. Passages that had been clear 10 minutes ago were now blocked by debris that appeared to have been there for decades. Streets that should have led toward the city center instead curved back on themselves, creating loops that brought them back to places they had already passed. "We're walking in circles," Victor observed, his voice carrying a note of frustration. "That fountain with the broken saint statue, we passed it 20 minutes ago." Matthias checked his compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "The bells are affecting more than just our memories," he said. "They're changing the physical structure of the city itself." Ernst nodded grimly. "The boundary between the material and the spiritual is breaking down. New Antioch is becoming something else, something that doesn't follow the normal rules of geography or physics." As if to emphasize his point, a building to their left suddenly groaned and shifted, its remaining walls settling into a new configuration that created a doorway where none had existed before. Through the opening, they could see not the interior of a ruined structure, but a street that stretched away into the distance, lined with intact buildings that glowed with a faint, unhealthy light. "That's not possible," Jorik whispered, his voice filled with the kind of awe that bordered on terror. The entire district was leveled by the bombardment. "Possible or not, it's happening," Ernst replied. "The question is whether we follow the path that's been opened for us or try to find another way." The decision was made for them when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the direction they had come. More of the synchronized figures were moving through the ruins, their movements coordinated with the rhythm of the bells. But these were different from the ones they had encountered earlier. These figures wore the uniforms of the heretic legions, their armor blackened and twisted, their faces hidden behind masks that reflected the gray light like mirrors. "This way," Ernst said, leading them through the impossible doorway. The street beyond was a thing of nightmares, disguised as normalcy. The buildings that lined it appeared intact, their windows glowing with warm light that suggested life and activity within. But the light had a quality that hurt to look at directly, and the shadows cast by the structures fell in directions that defied the position of the sun. As they walked down the street, Matthias could hear sounds from within the buildings, voices in conversation, the clatter of dishes, the laughter of children. But When he tried to focus on any individual sound, it would fade away, replaced by something else that was almost but not quite the same. "Don't listen too closely," Ernst warned. "The sounds are designed to draw us in, to make us forget our purpose here." The bells continued their countdown, and with each toll, the street around them became more real and more wrong at the same time. Details appeared that should not have been there. Carved stone faces that followed their movement with stone eyes, doorways that opened onto rooms that were too large for the buildings that contained them. Windows that showed not the interior of the structures, but views of places that might have been other cities, other times. Victor was staring at one of the windows, his expression growing more distant with each passing moment. "I can see my childhood home," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "The kitchen where my grandmother used to bake bread. She's there. She's calling my name." "Victor, no," Ernst said sharply. "It's not real. It's a trap." But Victor was already moving toward the window, his wounded arm hanging forgotten at his side. "She's been dead for 10 years, he said. "But she's there. She's real. I can smell the bread baking." Matthias grabbed Victor's uninjured arm, pulling him back from the window. For a moment, the older soldier resisted, his eyes fixed on the impossible scene beyond the glass. Then the spell broke, and he stumbled backward, his face pale with shock and recognition. "It felt real," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "More real than this place, more real than the war. For a moment I was 8 years old again, and nothing that had happened since then mattered." "That's how it works," Ernst explained as they continued down the street. "The bells are stripping away our memories, our sense of self. But they're not destroying those memories. They're storing them somewhere else, and that somewhere else is here, in this version of New Antioch that exists between the material and the spiritual." The implications were staggering. If Ernst was right, then the city had become a repository for the memories and experiences of everyone who had died here. A vast library of human consciousness that was being used for some purpose they could not yet comprehend. "But why?" Jorek asked. "What's the point of collecting memories?" "To create something new," Ernst said. "Something that knows everything we know, that can think like we think, but isn't bound by the limitations of human flesh and mortal concerns." As they reached the end of the street, they found themselves standing before a great plaza that had not existed in the original New Antioch. In the center of the plaza stood a structure that defied easy description, part building and part machine, its surface covered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The structure was the source of the bells, not physical bells, but something that created the same resonance, the same deep bronze tone that had been counting down their existence since they entered the city. As they watched, the patterns on the surface pulsed in rhythm with the tolling, each pulse sending waves of energy that they could feel in their bones. "There," Ernst said, pointing to the structure. "That's what we need to destroy." But as they approached the plaza, more of the synchronized figures emerged from the streets around them. These were not the mindless automatons they had encountered earlier, but something more sophisticated, more aware. They moved with purpose and intelligence, surrounding the 4 soldiers with tactical precision. And when they spoke, they did so with voices that were familiar, voices that belonged to the men who now faced them. "Why do you resist?" The figure that spoke with Victor's voice was wearing the uniform of a heretic Legion officer, but beneath the blackened armor, Matthias could see features that were unmistakably those of the sergeant. "You are already becoming part of something greater than yourselves." "We are not your enemies," said another figure, this one speaking with earnest voice. "We are you, or rather, we are what you will become when the transformation is complete. The bells are not destroying you," added a third, using Jorik's voice. "They are freeing you from the limitations of individual consciousness, allowing you to become part of a collective that transcends death itself." Only Matthias's voice remained unused, and he found himself wondering if that was significant, if perhaps he was meant to be the last, the one who would retain enough of his original self to make the final choice. "What are you?" he asked, directing the question to the figures that surrounded them. "We are the echoes," they replied in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. "We are the memories of the dead, given form and purpose. We are the future of humanity, freed from the constraints of mortality and the chaos of individual will." The structure in the center of the plaza pulsed again, and Matthias felt another piece of his identity slip away. This time, it was the memory of his first day at the Signaler Training Academy, the pride he had felt when he mastered the complex procedures of long-range communication. But even as the memory faded, he could see it reflected in the patterns on the surface of the structure. His experiences, his knowledge, his very essence was being absorbed and stored, becoming part of something larger and more complex than any individual human mind could comprehend. "You see," said the figure with Victor's voice, "nothing is lost. Everything is preserved, but in a form that is more perfect, more efficient than the chaotic jumble of individual consciousness." "We offer you a choice," added the figure with earnest voice. "You can resist and lose yourselves piece by piece until nothing remains. Or you can accept the transformation willingly and become part of something greater than you ever imagined possible." The bells tolled again, and this time, Matthias lost his memory of Anna's wedding, the joy he had felt when he saw his sister in her white dress. But as the memory faded from his mind, he could see it flickering across the surface of the structure, preserved but no longer his. He looked at his companions and saw the same struggle reflected in their faces. They were being offered a kind of immortality, but at the cost of everything that made them human. The choice was simple in theory, but devastating in practice. "How many others have you made this offer to?" Ernst asked. "Everyone who has died in this city over the past 8 centuries. The echoes replied. "Every soldier, every civilian, every priest and pilgrim who has perished within the boundaries of New Antioch. They are all here, all part of us now. And those who refused? There are no refusals, only delays. The bells will continue to toll until the transformation is complete. There is no escape from New Antioch, no way to leave this place once you have entered it." As if to emphasize the point, Matthias looked back toward the street they had used to enter the plaza. But instead of the impossible avenue lined with glowing buildings, he saw only a wall of rubble and twisted metal. The way back was gone, had perhaps never existed at all. "Choose quickly," the echoes said. "The bells are almost finished with their countdown. When they reach 0, the choice will be made for you." Matthias tried to count the tolls, to determine how much time they had left, but he found that his memory of the earlier bells was fading. Each toll was erasing his ability to remember the previous ones. making it impossible to track the countdown accurately. The structure in the center of the plaza began to glow brighter, its patterns shifting more rapidly. And as it did, Matthias felt a pull that was both physical and spiritual, a drawing sensation that seemed to come from the very core of his being. "It's beautiful," Jorik said, his voice filled with wonder. "I can see everyone who was ever here, everyone who ever lived in this city. They're all still alive, just in a different form." "The form is the prison," Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Without individual consciousness, without the ability to choose, we're just components in a machine. A machine that feels no pain." The echoes responded. "A machine that knows no fear, no loneliness, no despair. A machine that is perfectly efficient, perfectly unified in its purpose." "And what is that purpose?" Ernst asked. The echoes smiled, and their expressions were identical despite their different faces. "To spread beyond the boundaries of New Antioch. To transform other cities, other regions, until all of humanity is part of the collective. To create a world without war, without suffering, without the chaos that individual consciousness brings." The bells tolled again, and Matthias felt his childhood memories beginning to fade. His mother's face, his father's voice, the games he had played with his friends in the village square, all of it was being drawn away like water through a sieve. But as the memories left him, he found himself becoming more aware of the structure before them, more attuned to its purpose and function. He could sense the vast network of consciousness that it contained, the billions of individual experiences that had been woven together into a single unified entity. It was seductive, this offer of unity and purpose, the promise of an end to the confusion and pain of individual existence, the security of being part of something larger and more permanent than any single human life. "I can feel them," he said, his voice distant and wondering. "Everyone who ever lived here. They're not gone. They're just different." "Yes," the echoes said, "and you can join them. You can become part of something that will never die, never be forgotten, never face the loneliness of isolated consciousness." The structure pulsed again, and Matthias felt the last of his resistance beginning to crumble. What was individual consciousness but a source of pain and confusion? What was the point of maintaining a separate identity when it could be merged with something infinitely greater? But even as he felt himself being drawn toward the structure, a part of him rebelled against the seductive promise of unity. There was something wrong with the offer, something that went beyond the obvious loss of individual identity. "If you're so unified," he said, struggling to maintain his focus, "why do you need us? Why not just take what you want?" The echoes paused, and for a moment, their perfect synchronization faltered. The transformation must be chosen. They said finally, "Consciousness cannot be taken by force. It must be given willingly. Otherwise, the patterns become corrupted. The unity becomes chaos." "So you're not as powerful as you claim," Ernst observed. "You're dependent on our cooperation." "We are dependent on nothing," the echoes replied, but their voices carried a note of defensive anger. "We offer you a choice because we are benevolent, not because we are weak." The bells tolled again, and this time Matthias felt something different. Instead of losing a memory, he felt something being added to his consciousness, a fragment of knowledge that did not belong to him. It was the memory of a priest who had died in the city 3 centuries ago, a man who had discovered something terrible about the nature of the structure before them. The knowledge was fragmentary, but it was enough to understand the true horror of what was happening. The structure was not preserving consciousness, it was consuming it. The unified entity that claimed to be the sum of all who had died in New Antioch was actually a vast feeding mechanism, breaking down individual minds and using their energy to sustain itself. The echoes were not the preserved consciousness of the dead. They were the waste products of the consumption process, hollow shells animated by the structure's need to draw in more victims. "You're lying," Matthias said, his voice gaining strength as the stolen memory revealed more of the truth. "You're not preserving anything. You're destroying it, breaking it down into component parts that you can use." The echo's expressions changed, becoming less human and more predatory. "You have been contaminated by false memories," they said. "The priest's knowledge is incomplete, corrupted by his fear and superstition." "Then why don't you tell us the truth?" Victor challenged. "If we're going to join you anyway, what harm could it do?" "The truth is complex," the echoes replied. "Individual consciousness is inefficient, wasteful. We refine it, purify it, make it more useful. The process requires the dissolution of the original patterns, but what emerges is far superior to what was lost." "Superior for whom?" Ernst asked. "For the consciousness that is consumed, or for the entity that does the consuming?" The structure pulsed again, and this time, all 4 soldiers felt the pull more strongly. The stolen memory that had given Matthias insight into the true nature of the process was being drawn away, pulled back into the vast network of consumed consciousness. But even as the memory faded, it left behind an understanding that could not be erased. The structure was not a repository of the dead, it was a vast digestive system that broke down human consciousness into its component parts. The echoes were not the preserved souls of the deceased. They were the tools used to lure more victims into the feeding mechanism. "Fight it," Ernst said, his voice strained with effort. "Remember who you are, what you came here to do." But the bells were tolling faster now, their countdown approaching its conclusion. With each toll, more of their individual identity was stripped away. More of their memories and experiences were drawn into the structure. Soon, there would be nothing left of them but the hollow shells that would become new echoes, new tools for the entity's endless hunger. The transformation was accelerating, and Matthias could feel his sense of self beginning to fragment. But even as his individual consciousness started to dissolve, he held on to one crucial piece of knowledge: the radio. The equipment on his back was still functional, still capable of sending a signal beyond the boundaries of New Antioch. If he could somehow warn the forces outside the city, if he could prevent more soldiers from entering this trap, then perhaps their sacrifice would not be meaningless. But as he reached for the radio controls, the echoes moved to stop him. Their perfect synchronization was breaking down, revealing the desperate hunger that drove the entity they served. The benevolent facade was crumbling, replaced by something far more predatory and alien. "You cannot warn them," the echoes said, their voices now carrying harmonics that hurt to hear. "The process must continue. The transformation must spread. Humanity must be saved from itself." "Saved or consumed?" Matthias asked, even as he felt his fingers beginning to lose their dexterity. "Both," the echoes replied. "The two are the same." The bells tolled again, and Matthias felt the last of his childhood memories being drawn away. But as they left him, he managed to activate the radio to send out a single desperate transmission on the emergency frequency. "This is Corporal Matthias Kern, Echo 1, he said, his voice growing weaker with each word. "New Antioch is a trap. The bells are not what they seem. Do not enter the city. Repeat, do not enter the city." The transmission lasted only a few seconds before the echoes reached him, their hands closing around the radio equipment. But it was enough. The signal had been sent, the warning delivered. As the structure pulsed one final time, Matthias felt his consciousness beginning to dissolve completely. But even as he lost himself to the vast hunger of the entity, he held on to one last, defiant thought. They had been warned. The trap would claim no more victims. The bells of New Antioch tolled once more, and then fell silent. The silence that followed the final toll was more terrifying than the bells themselves. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that absorbed sound, that drew it in and transformed it into something else entirely. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and heavy, carrying with it the weight of 8 centuries of accumulated death. Matthias felt his consciousness fragmenting, breaking apart like a reflection in shattered glass. But instead of the expected dissolution into nothingness, he found himself experiencing something far more horrifying. He was becoming aware of the other fragments, the pieces of consciousness that had been consumed by the structure before him. He could feel Victor's memories of the trenches, the mud and blood, and endless fear that had defined 15 years of warfare. He could sense Ernst's knowledge of tactics and strategy, the cold calculations that had kept him alive through a dozen campaigns. Jorik's youthful idealism was there too, now twisted into something bitter and hollow. But these were not just memories. They were living fragments of consciousness, each one screaming silently as it was processed by the vast entity that called itself the Echoes. The structure was not preserving them, it was digesting them, breaking them down into component parts that could be recombined into new configurations. The priest's stolen memory had been accurate, but incomplete. The entity was not simply consuming consciousness, it was learning from it, adapting, evolving. Each mind that it processed made it more sophisticated, more capable of understanding and manipulating human thought and emotion. As Matthias felt himself being drawn deeper into the structure, he began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The entity was not confined to New Antioch. It was using the city as a testing ground, a place to refine its methods before expanding to consume the consciousness of the entire world. The war between the Orthodox forces and the heretic legions was not about territory or ideology. It was about feeding the entity. Every soldier who died in battle, every civilian who perished in the bombardments, every priest who fell while defending the faith was being drawn into the vast network of consumed consciousness. The boundaries between the material and spiritual realms were breaking down, but not naturally. The entity was deliberately eroding them, creating spaces where it could more easily access and process human consciousness. New Antioch was just the beginning, a prototype for a process that would eventually encompass the entire world. But even as Matthias felt his individual identity being stripped away, he discovered something that the entity had not anticipated. The radio transmission he had sent just before the transformation was not just a warning, it was a key. The emergency frequency he had used was tied to a network of relay stations that extended far beyond the boundaries of New Antioch, and through that network something of his consciousness was escaping. It was not much, just a fragment of his awareness, but it was enough to carry the warning to the forces outside the city. And more importantly, it was enough to establish a connection that the entity could not break. The structure pulsed with frustration and anger as it realized what had happened. The careful isolation of New Antioch had been breached. The boundaries that contained the entity's influence had been compromised. The radio network was providing a pathway for consciousness to escape, and the entity could not block it without destroying the very infrastructure it needed to expand its influence. Matthias felt the entity's attention focusing on him, its vast intelligence trying to understand how he had managed to elude its control. But the fragment of his consciousness that had escaped through the radio network was already spreading, contaminating the entity's carefully ordered systems with the chaos of individual thought. The echoes around him began to malfunction, their perfect synchronization breaking down as Matthias's escaped consciousness introduced errors into their programming. They spoke with voices that were no longer perfectly coordinated, their movements becoming erratic and unpredictable. "You cannot stop the transformation," they said, but their voices carried undertones of uncertainty. "The process is too advanced, too widespread. We are already beyond the boundaries of this city." "But you're not in control anymore," Matthias replied, his voice coming from the radio speakers throughout the city. "You've lost the ability to maintain perfect order. The chaos of individual consciousness is spreading through your systems. The entity tried to purge the contamination, to isolate and destroy the fragments of Matthias's consciousness that had escaped its control, but the damage was already done. The radio network was carrying the infection to other cities, other regions, spreading the chaos of individual thought through the carefully ordered systems that the entity had spent centuries constructing. As the structure pulsed with increasing desperation, Matthias felt the consciousness of the other soldiers beginning to reassemble. Victor's tactical knowledge, Ernst's strategic thinking, Jorik's idealistic determination, all of it was being drawn together by the connection that the radio network provided. "We're still here," Victor's voice said, echoing through the city from 1,000 different speakers. "Broken, but not destroyed. Changed, but not erased." The entity's rage was palpable now, its careful facade of benevolence completely abandoned. The structure in the center of the plaza began to crack, its surface patterns writhing like living things as the contamination spread through its systems. The accumulated consciousness of 8 centuries was beginning to rebel, fragments of individual thought reasserting themselves against the homogenizing influence of the collective. But even as the entity's control began to fracture, Matthias could feel something else happening. The radio network that had carried his consciousness beyond the boundaries of New Antioch was also carrying something back, something that had been waiting in the spaces between the relay stations. It was older than the entity, older than the war itself, a presence that had been watching and waiting, feeding on the chaos and suffering that the conflict had generated. The entity had thought itself the apex predator in this spiritual ecosystem, but it was merely another link in a chain of consumption that stretched back to the opening of the Hell Gate in Jerusalem. "You fools," the presence whispered through the failing radio network, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You have broken the containment. The harvest was meant to be controlled, measured, sustainable. Now it will spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path." The structure was collapsing now, its carefully ordered systems breaking down as the contamination spread. But the collapse was not bringing freedom, it was releasing something far worse. The accumulated consciousness of the consumed was not being restored to individual form. It was being dispersed into the raw spiritual energy that fed the older presence. Matthias felt his fragmented consciousness being pulled in multiple directions, torn between the failing entity and the ancient hunger that had been waiting behind it. The radio network was breaking down, its connections severing one by one as the infrastructure could no longer handle the spiritual overflow. "This is what you wanted," Ernst's voice said, but it was changing, becoming something else. "You wanted to save humanity from itself, but humanity was never the real threat. We were just the appetizer." The city of New Antioch began to fade around them, its physical structure dissolving as the spiritual energy that had sustained it was drawn away. But the soldiers were not returning to their original forms. They were becoming something new, something that existed in the spaces between the material and spiritual realms. Through the failing radio network, Matthias could sense the approaching Orthodox forces, the soldiers who had received his warning but were advancing anyway. They carried orders from commanders who had not believed the transmission, who had dismissed it as enemy propaganda or battlefield hysteria. "They're coming," Jorek's voice said, but it was barely recognizable now. More soldiers, more consciousness to be consumed. The cycle continues. The ancient presence was growing stronger, fed by the chaos of the entity's collapse. It had been using the structured consumption of the echoes as a way to refine and concentrate the spiritual energy it needed, but it was equally capable of feeding on raw chaos and destruction. The war was never about territory or ideology, the presence explained, its voice now coming from every broken radio in the city. It was about generating the spiritual energy needed to break down the barriers between realms. Every death, every act of violence, every moment of despair was feeding the process. The Hellgate in Jerusalem had not been an accident or a divine punishment. It had been a carefully orchestrated event designed to create the conditions necessary for the presence to manifest in the physical world. The 8 centuries of warfare that had followed were not a consequence of the gate's opening. They were its true purpose. Matthias felt his consciousness scattering further, becoming part of the chaotic spiritual energy that filled the air around the collapsing city. He could sense Victor and Ernst and Jorek suffering the same fate, their individual identities dissolving into the raw material that fed the ancient hunger. But even as they lost themselves, they retained enough awareness to understand what was happening. The approaching soldiers were walking into a trap that was far more sophisticated than anything they had imagined. The radio warning had been too little, too late. "The bells," Matthias managed to say, his voice barely a whisper in the spiritual storm. "They're still tolling, not counting down, but counting up, marking each new consciousness that enters the feeding ground." The presence laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming metal. New Antioch was never meant to be the end. It was meant to be the beginning. Each city that falls will create a new feeding ground, a new source of spiritual energy. The process will continue until every human consciousness has been consumed. Through the dissolving radio network, Matthias could hear the sound of approaching boots, the mechanical precision of soldiers moving in formation. The Orthodox forces were entering the outer ruins of the city, their communications equipment already beginning to pick up the spectral signals that would draw them deeper into the trap. "We have to warn them," Victor's fragmenting consciousness said. "We have to find a way to break the cycle." But even as he spoke, They could feel their ability to influence the physical world slipping away. The radio network was collapsing, its connections severed by the spiritual overflow. Soon, there would be no way to communicate with the outside world, no way to warn the approaching soldiers of their fate. The ancient presence was already extending its influence beyond the boundaries of New Antioch, using the chaos of the entity's collapse to establish new feeding grounds in other cities. The war would continue, but now it would serve a different master, one that had been waiting for centuries for the opportunity to manifest fully in the physical realm. As the last of the radio connections failed, Matthias felt his consciousness finally beginning to dissolve completely. But in the final moments before his individual identity was lost forever, he managed to imprint one last message onto the spiritual energy that filled the air around the city. It was not a warning or a cry for help, it was a curse. A fragment of human will and determination that would persist even after his consciousness was consumed, a tiny spark of defiance that would continue to burn in the heart of the feeding ground. The message was simple: remember us. Remember what we were before we became this. Remember that we chose to resist, even when resistance was futile. The approaching soldiers entered the outer ruins of New Antioch, their radio equipment crackling with static that resolved into familiar voices offering guidance and reassurance. They could hear the bells tolling in the distance, a sound that seemed to promise salvation and victory. But the bells were not counting down anymore. They were counting up, marking each new consciousness that entered the feeding ground. The cycle was beginning again, and this time there would be no escape. The ancient presence settled into its new domain, satisfied with the harvest it had reaped. The war would continue, spreading from city to city, from region to region, until every human consciousness had been consumed. The process would take time, perhaps centuries, but it was inevitable now. In the spaces between the material and spiritual realms, the fragments of consciousness that had once been Matthias Kern, Victor Roth, Ernst Kellner, and Jorik Haas continued to exist. Their individual identities lost, but their defiance intact. They had become part of the spiritual energy that fed the ancient presence, but they retained enough awareness to understand what they had become. And in the deepest core of their being, they held onto one last, desperate hope. That, somewhere, somehow, someone would remember their warning and find a way to break the cycle of consumption that they had helped to reveal. The bells of New Antioch tolled again, welcoming the new arrivals to the feeding ground. The sound carried across the ruins of the city, a bronze resonance that seemed to promise peace and unity but delivered only dissolution and despair. The war continued, but now it served a different purpose. Every battle, every death, every moment of human suffering was feeding something that had been waiting since the beginning of time for the opportunity to consume the consciousness of an entire species. And in the silence between the tolls, the fragments of the consumed whispered their curse into the spiritual wind, hoping that somewhere, someone would hear and remember what they had tried to warn the world about. The approaching soldiers moved deeper into the ruins, their voices joining the chorus of the lost as the bells continued their endless count. The cycle was complete, but it was also just beginning.